Hello. So for this Black History Month 2025 video, we're going to be talking about Mary Seacole's Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. Mary Seacole was one of those properly badass people from history, who doesn't get enough recognition, in my view, for how awesome she was. She was born in Jamaica around the year 1800. She's vague about the actual year of her birth because as a lady, she does not want to give away her age, etc., etc. But basically, she has all of these adventures and she does all of these things that she wants to do. She becomes a nurse because she wants to be useful, and because she very early in life started to really admire medical practitioners. She goes to Panama. She follows her brother there. He goes and basically sets up a sort of hotel slash store slash restaurant thing. And she goes and she sets up her own hotel, restaurant, store thing. And then she gets sort of bored with that. And she goes to a different place in Panama and sets up a different hotel, restaurant, store thing. Then she gets bored with that and she goes back to Jamaica and she practices medicine there for a while. And then she goes to London to see the capital city of the British Empire. And then she goes to the Crimean War and she serves as a nurse unofficially. And she runs a sort of a sutlery, basically. So a sort of, again, a sort of restaurant slash shop slash convalescent home, basically. Like she serves meals there. She sells basic provisions, but also luxury items, mostly to officers in the British Army or the British military, Army, Navy, etc. And she provides space for officers particularly, who are injured and who either can't get places in the overcrowded hospitals or who want a more sort of exclusive convalescence area. And one of the cool things about her service in Crimea is that she put in a lot of effort to get there. Like she initially started campaigning to the War Office, I think was the first one. And then she went to all of these like different institutions within the British military, including Florence Nightingale's nursing recruitment services, and basically was like, listen, I'm a nurse. I'm a fucking awesome nurse. I've got these testimonials from all of these people in the British military that I've treated in Jamaica and Panama. I want to go help in the Crimea. And they're basically like, yeah, but no, sorry. And so finally she's like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to go over there on my own. I'm going to get, I've got a contact over there in the Crimea, a dude that I can work with. I'm going to buy up a bunch of supplies. I'm going to sail down there on a ship and I'm going to set up my own fucking nursing business and store, since nobody will hire me to do it officially through the proper channels. And she does. She's fucking awesome. She was extremely hardcore, and she went through these very, very difficult situations, not just the war in Crimea, which was, of course, a horrific experience between, obviously, the fighting and the casualties that resulted from that. But disease was rampant in Crimea. Rations, provisions, supplies were very difficult to get, particularly for the Allied troops, in which the British were part of the Allies, the British, French, Turks, and a number of other nations fought the Russians in the Crimean War, if you don't know. A lot of Americans especially don't know much about the history of places other than the U.S. To be honest, we don't know that much about American history, most of us either. We know American mythology, but that's a separate issue. But because the Allies had to basically import all of their supplies across the Black Sea, it was very, very difficult to keep supplies. So she went through that. But also she went to Panama in the early 1800s, and it was this very sort of lawless place in which, right, they had just recently gained independence from Spain, and actually, I'm not even sure if they had gained independence from Spain when she went there. We don't know exactly what year she went, or I don't know from her text. But so it's this very lawless place. It's very remote. It's rife with disease. Again, tropical diseases, particularly things like cholera. There's a lot of violence, particularly violence between the local Spanish/indigenous population and Americans who've gone there prospecting for gold. The Americans seem to be the most troublesome in her narrative of that place. And there's natural disasters like flooding and things like this. So she goes through all of these hardships, and she's constantly like, yeah, it was tough, but I wanted to be useful. And so I went and I did these very, very difficult, dangerous things. And I basically succeeded at everything I ever did. She's super cool. So I want to take you through a few bits of this narrative that I find most interesting or most sort of noteworthy. And this is really just jumping through her story. I've given you the general sort of overview of it. But I want to give you the opening portion, the first paragraph of Seacole's narrative, because I think it gives a good insight into her worldview and the way that she looks at herself, her purpose, and those around her. So she says here, I was born in the town of Kingston in the island of Jamaica sometime in the present century. As a female and a widow, I may be well excused giving the precise date of this important event. But I do not mind confessing that the century and myself were both young together, and that we have grown side by side into age and consequence. I am a Creole, and have good Scotch blood coursing in my veins. My father was a soldier of an old Scotch family, and to him I often trace my affection for a camp life, and my sympathy with what I have heard my friends call the pomp, pride, and circumstance of glorious war. Many people have also traced to my Scotch blood that energy and activity which are not always found in the Creole race, and which have carried me to so many varied scenes. And perhaps they are right. I have often heard the term lazy Creole applied to my country people, but I am sure I do not know what it is to be indolent. All my life long I have followed the impulse which led me to be up and doing, and so far from resting idle anywhere, I have never wanted inclination to rove, nor will powerful enough to find a way to carry out my wishes. That these qualities have led me into many countries and brought me into some strange and amusing adventures, the reader, if he or she has the patience to get through this book, will see. Some people indeed have called me quite a female Ulysses. I believe that they intend it as a compliment, but from my experience of the Greeks, I do not consider it a very flattering one. So, it's interesting. It's an interesting opening, right? Again, one of the things that we get right from the beginning with Seacole is her sort of central characteristic is activity. She is always doing stuff. She's always taking on challenges, etc., etc. And that carries out throughout the narrative, right? She's always going places. She's always building businesses, maintaining businesses in these very challenging environments, taking on these different whatever it is, right? We also get a troublesome understanding of race introduced here. Seacole seems quite ambivalent about different races and ethnicities, including her own people. She's generally quite positive about Jamaicans, but, I mean, as we see here in this opening, she doesn't exactly contradict the stereotype of a lazy Creole. And that final reference, she does have generally quite a negative impression of Greeks, who she meets a lot of when she is in Crimea and traveling to Crimea. She tends to think of them as lazy thieves. She has a similar, generally negative impression of Turks and of indigenous or Hispanic Panamanians. Interestingly enough, she does say she spends a lot of time on her experiences in Panama, and one of the things that she comes back to repeatedly is how these were very much mixed race communities. And the way that she characterizes the places she was in is that the majority of people were Hispanic or indigenous, and then there was a sort of elite group of mostly African Americans who had escaped from slavery in the United States and come down to Central America. And because they were industrious and enterprising, they had generally sort of entered these roles of like local civil servants, bureaucrats, local sort of governors, things like that. The Americans, she talks about being generally very polite, but pretty racist. Again, especially against Black people. And there are some great sort of Black pride moments in this opening 40% or so of the narrative where she's in Panama. Moments in which I can't remember the name of the position, but basically a sort of local governor magistrate type figure who is an African American who had escaped from slavery, basically like locks up some Americans for committing crimes because they had insulted him and questioned his authority as a Black man. And so there is this sort of great moment. But she says ultimately the Americans were allowed to escape from the jail. But there's also this moment where this guy she's about to leave Panama, and this group of people that had come to her hotel, that had eaten in her restaurant, that had basically like really been her friends and supporters, they all sort of come together for a big farewell dinner. And this American makes this lengthy toast where basically he's like, "You're super awesome. Everybody loves you. We just wish that you weren't mixed race." And she says, "Gentlemen, I return you my best thanks for your kindness in drinking my health. As for what I have done in Cruces, Providence evidently made me to be useful, and I can't help it. But I must say that I don't altogether appreciate your friend's kind wishes with respect to my complexion. If it had been as dark as any N-words, I should have been just as happy and as useful and as much respected by those whose respect I value. And as to his offer of bleaching me, I should, even if it were practicable, decline it without any thanks. As to the society which the process might gain me admission into, all I can say is that, judging from the specimens I have met with here and elsewhere, I don't think that I shall lose much by being excluded from it. So, gentlemen, I drink to you and the general reformation of American manners. That's a pretty badass 19th century way of saying you can go fuck yourself. So that's a super cool passage. I really, really like that. Some of the other things that I want to talk fairly briefly about in terms of Mary Seacole's adventures. I want to read you this passage because once she's made it to Crimea, she basically tries again to get connected with Florence Nightingale, who, of course, I mean, most people I think will know this. Florence Nightingale, one of the most famous people in history. She basically revolutionized nursing during the Crimean War. She made it a sort of formal, functional industry as opposed to a much more sort of individual, chaotic type thing. Florence Nightingale, one of the most important figures in history, and Seacole had tried to join up with Nightingale's nursing corps while she was in London. She was turned down. So Seacole comes to the Crimea, and she goes again to this time try and see Florence Nightingale herself. And she says, she's gone through this sort of long thing where she's sort of moved through these different hospitals and been sort of helping out, et cetera, et cetera. She's had to sort of work her way through talking to different people. Finally, she says here, in half an hour's time, I'm admitted to Miss Nightingale's presence. A slight figure in the nurse's dress with a pale, gentle, and withal firm face, resting lightly in the palm of one white hand, while the other supports the elbow, a position which gives to her countenance a keen, inquiring expression which is rather marked. Standing thus in repose and yet keenly observant, the great sign of impatience at any time, a slight, perhaps unwavering or unwitting motion of the firmly planted right foot, was Florence Nightingale, that Englishwoman whose name shall never die, but sound like music on the lips of British men until the hour of doom. I mean, Seacole doesn't say a massive amount about Florence Nightingale, in large part because they don't seem to have really spent much time together. We get the impression from Seacole's narrative that Nightingale formed a positive impression of her, but didn't bring her into the sort of official nursing corps. And then basically Florence Nightingale drops out of the story. So it is this sort of celebrity cameo almost. But it's interesting that there's definitely a sort of admiring element to this, even in this very short discussion of Florence Nightingale. Yeah. So again, it's an overall really cool sort of adventure story, autobiographical adventure story. I will mention I'm not personally that big a fan of the sort of Victorian autobiography. It's not really a genre that I particularly enjoy that much. Mary Seacole as a person, super cool, super amazing, really, really interesting. Yeah, good stuff.